And welcome to this one-day symposium on technologies of space, verticality, volume and infrastructure. My name is Liv Hausken and I'm from the Department of Media and Communication at this university. And I'm also head of the interdisciplinary research field called Media Aesthetics. And I'm welcoming you on behalf of this Media Aesthetic Research Group who organized today's event. Media aesthetic research interrogates the relation between media technologies, perception, and mediation. It is, as mentioned, a basically interdisciplinary field, which means that it's not just a field crossing disciplinary boundaries, but is basically interested in the interdisciplinary arena as such. And from the perspective, or should I say perspectives, of media aesthetics, there are many topics or topoi that are of special interest, and one of them is space. Technologies of space, perception of space, and mediation of space. So this media aesthetic triad, technology, perception, and mediation, will today challenge itself, or perhaps also challenge, to nicely selected triads, if I may continue to use or exploit such a figure. And the first of these triads are fields, or perhaps disciplines. In the invitation they are called spatial disciplines. They are here represented by geography, architecture, and media aesthetics. Geography and architecture are perhaps the obvious older sisters in this family of three. But coming from media studies, we will argue that the little brother media studies also are becoming increasingly more important as he grows older and understands his potential. We have invited three people, somehow representing each of these three fields or disciplines: Mark Dorian, Lisa Parks, and Stuart Elden. They're not here in order to represent these fields, but we might expect that their situatedness in their respective fields will color their ideas on technologies of space. So, through their talks, we may witness not just a meeting between intellectuals, but also between spatial disciplines: geography, architecture, and media studies. The third triad here this morning is a topical triad: verticality, volume, and infrastructure. Our three prominent guests are invited to present their thoughts on how the conceptions of space presently are undergoing significant changes. We could talk about changes from plane surface to verticality, viewing the world from above or below the surface. We could think of going from mapping horizontal fields to a 2D space into mapping 3D space or volume. And we could think of ways of dividing and organizing this space in grids and transport systems and networks or infrastructures. We've invited three keynotes and given them 1 hour each to present what they found most important in thinking about space and spatiality today. And I'm proud and excited to welcome you all to this event. I will give the word to Susanna Espiceta, who will introduce the first speaker. She is one of the organizers of the symposium, and she will chair the first session. Susanna.
Okay, so I'm extremely happy to be able to introduce today's first speaker, who's Stuart Elden. And Stuart Elden is Professor of Political Theory and Geography at the University of Warwick, and Monash Warwick Professor in the Faculty of Arts at Monash University, Australia. And Elden is a leading scholar in what could perhaps be described as an interdisciplinary spatial field that crosses geography, political science, and philosophy. And he's the author of 7 monographs, including the award-winning Terror and Territory, The Spatial Extent of Sovereignty, which came out with University of Minnesota Press in 2009, and The Birth of Territory, which came out with University of Chicago Press in 2013. And as indicated by these titles, the concept and practice of territory is one of Elden's fundamental or sort of pivotal research interests. And his contributions here have been vital in rethinking and expanding the conception of territory within political geography and bordering disciplines. And one of the key arguments made in Elden's work is that we need to understand territory as a process, continually made and remade, as he states it, and as such that it also is a political technology or a bundle of technologies, as he also states. Of particular interest for this conference, or for this symposium, I think is also his work, another dimension of his work, where he's consistently challenged the flat and planar conception of territory by understanding it as being not simply vertical, including, for instance, airspace, but also volumetric, including depth as well as height, and oblique angles as well as a straightly vertical. Extrapolating the concept of territory, not just to countries and regions, but also to the level of the Earth itself, and Earth here understand really as a geological concept. Elden is recently exploring the notion of terrain. In this concept, the geopolitical and the geophysical meet. So in extremely interesting ways, this work we find ties in with perspectives of new materialism and also an ongoing turn towards the elemental in media theory and philosophy, as well as also geological notions of time. His most recent work has been an intellectual history of Michel Foucault's career, leading to 2 books thus far: Foucault's Last Decade, which came out with Polity Press in 2016, and Foucault, The Birth of Power, which came out also with Polity Press just this January. A 3rd book is already in progress, entitled The Early Foucault, looking at Foucault's work in the 1950s. And Stuart Elden has also edited and co-edited several volumes of Henri Lefebvre's writings and collections on Foucault, again, Immanuel Kant, and also Peter Sloterdijk. And through many of these publications, he has expanded the discourse of the spatial disciplines by introducing little-known texts, or by identifying in these writings dimensions of spatial political thinking outside explicitly or established spatial terms. Continuing his work on territory, Elden has recently finished a manuscript examining how territory features in Shakespeare's plays, and he's now returning to more contemporary concerns about territory, especially again in relation to terrain, which is also the topic of today's talk. He's part of a research project titled Ice Law, run by Philip Steinberg from Durham University, which recognizes the complications that ice poses for the demarcation of land from water. And this project investigates, as it says in the project statement, the potential for a legal framework that acknowledges the complex geophysical environment in the world's frozen regions. And in this project, again, Elden leads the sub-theme on territory. And very lastly, I think it's worth mentioning that Stuart Elden also runs an extremely prolific and informative blog titled Progressive Geographies that I recommend all of you to follow. And the title of his talk here today is Terrain's Volume. So welcome.
Thank you so much for that very generous introduction, which covers a number of the themes that I'm going to try and explore today. And thank you for the invitation to be here. It's a real pleasure to talk to you. As I understand the provocation of this workshop, as I understand the provocation of this workshop, it's to go beyond a narrow, flattened sense of space, what we might call the cartographic imagination, in which complex three-dimensional spaces, landscapes, get represented on a two-dimensional surface, but also crucially fix Earth processes at a single moment in time. Now, representations of complex landscapes are frequently reduced in this kind of way of thinking to a plane where shapes meet, separated by a line, a border. But maps have long tried to grapple with how do you represent height and depth on their usually two-dimensional surface. And contour lines and relief shading are two of the more common, but as modern technologies of cartography develop, different possibilities emerge. Now, what I'm going to suggest today is that the notion of terrain is a useful term to try and think about some of these issues, and I think it very much forces us to account for the complexity of height and depth, this question of volume, as well as the vertical that is a theme of the conference. Now, I wrote about this first in a 2013 article, which we discussed at the smaller reading workshop yesterday, and I'm just going to give a very brief couple of points from this. But this was an iconic view. This is my own photograph, but it's a view that many people have represented. And it's a view of a site in the West Bank, where you can see the main road that is visible there is an Israeli road that links Israeli settlements in the West Bank to Jerusalem itself. It's a road that is on elevated platforms. It's a road that has got walls either side of the road, which is both to stop people throwing things from cars and to throw things at cars. But underneath it, along the valley floor, the more sort of serpentine road snaking through the landscape, is a Palestinian road that links Palestinian villages in the West Bank. Now, the suggestion that people give when they use this as an example is that only a three-dimensional way of thinking can help us to understand the complex political geographies of this space. If you simply try to represent this on a two-dimensional surface, you will fail to grasp the contested and complicated nature of that landscape. And the key person that informed my work, my initial thinking about this, was the Israeli architect, now an academic at Goldsmiths University, Eyal Weizman, particularly in his book, The Hollow Land, which uses that same view as part of the cover image of that. And Eyal's point in that work, and in a number of other pieces, is to suggest that two-dimensional maps, fundamental to the understanding of political borders, the straightforward way that we think about these issues, have been drawn time and again for the West Bank, but each time they've failed to capture the vertical dimensions of this issue. Now, that vertical dimension isn't simply about things like the road, although I think the road is a good example that really highlights this point, but it's about the built landscape much more generally and its interaction with the physical nature of the landscape, which is a theme I'm going to keep returning to in this talk. It's not just the building of houses in settlements, although the fact that most settlements tend to be on the hilltops is important in understanding that topography of the region. It's not just the wall or the fence of the separation barrier, but also the civil engineering projects of other walls and fences. There are many walls and fences in the West Bank. But also the tunnels, the bridges, the roads, the flyovers, the road blocks, the checkpoints, and so on. And it's also the highly political infrastructure of things such as drainage and irrigation pipes and canals and cables. Now, this work is complemented. Another person who's done more interesting work on this is Stephen Graham, whose exploration in the most recent of his books, Vertical, which is to look at how we should look at the spaces of a city from the bunkers and the tunnels underneath the city to the satellites that are flying above it. And it builds on his earlier work, exemplified here by two of his books, one of which, the co-authored book Splintering Urbanism with Simon Marvin, that really looks at how cities work, how cities are put together, and how infrastructure is crucial in making a city function. And then in the Cities Under Siege book, how that very same infrastructure is often the target of military interventions, the turning the city off kind of idea. You target the electric substations, you target the sewage systems in a city. And so those two books, I think, have begun to open up the themes that very much come to the fore in his most recent book on Vertical. And I think that work, I think his work is now drawing on some of the writings on urban exploration of what goes on below the surface of a city. People like Bradley Garrett's work, the Place Hacking the City book, where he and other people would get into places that make a city function but are usually off limits for people to get into. So disused underground railway stations in London, the Mail Rail, which was an old, now mothballed system that used to deliver packages and letters through the City of London, infrastructure sites, buildings and so on. The things that make a city work, but are often not the spaces that you would normally encounter as you go through the city. Now, I think all of this work is really interesting and important, and really what I'm doing is trying to just push this a little bit further in taking account not just of the built environment, but the physical landscape as well, and the interaction between those things. Now, the British Library has an exhibition on maps, which is just about to finish, but it's on maps in the 20th century. And what's interesting, I think, about that exhibition in part, is that they have some maps that try to break from this two-dimensional way of seeing a landscape. Now, I'm aware that showing you images, the next two images are going to be three-dimensional images. I'm showing them to you on a two-dimensional screen, but I hope at least you will get the idea of what these are trying to capture. This first one is actually a two-dimensional map. It's a map of the island of Utopia by an artist. It's a fictional map. You have Pearl Harbor at the foot and Hiroshima Bay at the north, so it's a juxtaposition of actually existing landscapes into a single island. But what you can see on there is that clearly the artist is trying to show how you might represent a three-dimensional landscape on a two-dimensional surface. You can see the shading and the relief lines to show the topography, the physicality, the terrain of that landscape. This is more like a kind of an architectural section. It's a map of the West Front in the First World War between France and Germany. And it's a map that if you see it in physical shape, is raised off the surface, because what they have done when they constructed this map, which was through the use of field commanders in the First World War, was that they have taken pieces of wood and layered them and then glued bits of map onto that wood to build up a three-dimensional representation of the landscape in order that the military commanders can understand what I would call the terrain over which they are fighting. And a final map, just to give an example, and this one really suffers unfortunately from compressing it onto a two-dimensional screen, but it's a three-dimensional map that's a kind of a raised plastic map to give a sense of the terrain of the Middle East. It was a map that was made in the early 1970s for the United States to try to give an idea of the time when Israel was fighting the 67 war and the 73 war against its neighbours, what the physical nature of the landscape meant for that kind of attack. So you can see in the Sinai Peninsula the mountainous region to the south. You can see the topography rising in the West Bank, then extending northwards into the Golan Heights. So it's a map that on the wall is not a flat surface, but is raised away by the way that they've designed this map, to try to give a sense of the nature of the landscape rather than simply trying to represent it on a two-dimensional surface. Now, more generally, what I think that the notions I'm going to try and explore today help us to do is to break with the idea that we should simply think about terrain in relation to land. That we need to think about terrain in relation to the sea, and crucially for themes of this workshop, what goes on beneath the surface of the sea bed, as well as the subterranean, so the submarine as well as the subterranean, in thinking about these issues. To think about the notion of terrain, which I'm going to explore with you here this morning in more detail, I think forces us to go beyond straightforward ways that we map geophysical state onto geopolitical realm. So from gas, solid, liquid, in other words, airspace, land, water, and the different political legal regimes that pertain to those things. I think that terrain forces us to recognise that some of these states are malleable, that change, and particularly with the impact of climate change, and particularly coming into focus today, that some of these things are not nearly as straightforward as we might think about. Coastlines are changing, islands are becoming submerged, glaciers are melting, previously frozen sea routes are becoming open to navigation. All of those material processes, geophysical processes, are transforming the way that we think about territory. Terrain, it seems to me, is a helpful way of beginning to think about some of those issues. And a theme that we discussed a little bit yesterday, the volumetric, which is a term that comes from cartography and from physics. The volumetric seems to me to be helpful here because it combines both the volume, i.e. the space in 3 dimensions, and the notion of a metric, the calculative way of grasping and understanding these processes and so on, of calculation, of measuring, of surveying, of managing, controlling and ordering in combination with that 3-dimensional sense of landscape and territory. And it's a term that Klaus Dodds and Mark Nuttall have picked up in their most recent book about the Scramble for the Poles, which looks at the geopolitics both of the Arctic and of the Antarctic, and they begin talking about volumetric territory, and I would suggest in what I'm going to talk about today, volumetric terrain is perhaps helpful to think about that. Rachel Squire, who's a PhD student at Royal Holloway, is doing work on US submarine bases in the Cold War, thinking again about the depth in the ocean and the surface of the ocean depths as a particular space that was a contested area in the Cold War. So the key question that I'm trying to think about here is how theories of territory, work that I've done in the past, can better account for the complexities of the geophysical. Would something like a political geomorphology be possible or even desirable? Now, when people talk about the materiality of territory, I think a lot of the work has rightly focused on the built landscape. They're focused on things that mark borders between states. So they look at walls, fences, ditches, tunnels, roads, roadblocks, cleared vistas where they cut a path through a forest, for example. The US-Canada has this to mark where the US and the Canada border actually is in the landscape. Now, many of those are at the very borders of states, the very extremities of the edges of states, but the built landscape of territory, at least on the argument I'm going to put forward today, extends throughout the entire fabric of the state. States are always making and remaking their territories throughout the entire area that they control. This is a process that some have called de- and re-territorialization, the making and remaking of territory not being something that is fixed and something that is being made and remade through a continually contested set of processes. I think we can also think about this in terms of state and spatial strategies, or state territorial strategies, perhaps in a more specific way, and the resistances to them, the way that these are challenged by other states and by other political actors. And this, for me, starts to bring in questions that I know my own work has neglected around embodiment, corporeality, of bodies in places and places embodied, and the continually contested nature of bodies and places around these issues. But the materiality of territory, for me, should also be able to take account of issues around the geophysical landscape. Many borders use landmarks such as mountain ranges, rivers, coastlines, deserts, and so on. The idea that these are natural borders, to contrast with the artificial borders of the geometric lines drawn through the continent of Africa, for example, the idea that these are natural borders has long been discredited. But the fact that states use natural features as the markers for their boundaries in many places seems to me that we need to have a better theorization of how these notions come together. And one example would be the US-Mexico border, obviously with Trump very much in the news at the moment. These are pictures that were taken, though, over 5 years ago to show what is already there, not what is going to be built or might be built in future, but what is already there as a marker on the landscape. So this is in the southern point of Arizona, marking the landscape with this fence wall that you can see stretching out for a long distance towards the east. But like many walls or barriers, it's not to prevent all movement, it's to prevent some movement, or it's to regulate movement, or it's to channel movement into particular places. And so this is designed so that small animals, snakes and so on, can actually get through the borderline, even though humans are not able to pass at this point. But from the very point where I took this photograph, if I turned 90 degrees, I could take this photograph. It comes to an end. Now, what happens as it comes to an end is quite interesting, because clearly a human body could walk around this, but because it's got these blocks here, these would stop a vehicle from moving them. Now, given the inhospitable nature of the landscape, of what I would call the terrain, if you didn't have a vehicle to move you around, then you wouldn't get very far in this landscape. So it starts to use the physical nature of the landscape as it becomes more mountainous in this area, and these kinds of barriers to actually prevent movement in a slightly different way from having to continue the wall in a straightforward sense. The very nature of the terrain becomes part of the bordering practice at this point. A similar example would be the way that Frontex, the European border agency, uses the Mediterranean effectively as border, uses the inhospitable nature of the terrain as that sea as one of the ways to prevent migrant boats from getting through. It's an attempt to use the physical landscape in part as the bordering practice around this. So the aim of my work here on bringing in this notion of terrain is to try and get theories of territory to better account for these kinds of features, where so many things that we think of as the boundaries of states that use a physical marker are complicated by geophysical processes that transform those borders. The way that dynamic features of the Earth, such as rivers, oceans, polar regions, glaciers, and airspace and the subsurface, all interact with each other and transform and change, and then create problems for the geopolitical way of thinking about this. This is why I think that the notion of terrain might be helpful to make sense of some of those issues. And part of the reason I think terrain is helpful is because looking at landscapes like this, it forces us away from that straightforward sense of a flat cartographic way of thinking about space. It forces us to take account of the vertical, the volume, themes of this conference. We're going away from the third term in this conference's title, infrastructure. Infrastructure is certainly important, but infrastructure alongside the physical landscape, not just the built landscape in this. Now, who does work on the notion of terrain? Terrain actually seems to me to be an under-theorized notion, which I think is surprising given the importance that it has. It's a term within the discipline of geography that tends to be the preserve either of physical geographers or of military geographers, and they don't often, it seems to me, talk to each other around this. Terrain usually refers to topography, i.e. the vertical and horizontal aspects of the surface of the Earth, and then the notion of topography is used to analyse how troops, artillery, resources can move, defend and attack in military geography. But in both traditions, both physical geography and military geography, I think the term is used in a relatively unproblematic way to describe the types and textures of particular spaces, and I'll come back to this point, land forms rather than land processes. Now, in physical geography, it seems to me that the term terrain is used as a relatively unproblematic term. One of my old colleagues at Durham says, to some of us, terrain analysis means the quantitative analysis of terrain. In other words, you need to qualify the mode of analysis, but you don't need to qualify the object of analysis. The object of analysis is straightforward. It's the mode of analysis that is the thing that is complicated and needs the clarification. And in an entire book, this one, Colin Mitchell's book on terrain evaluation, disqualifies a lot of things from being terrain, and then very quickly, I think, turns to the notion of terrain evaluation. I'm going to read this quote, and then I'm going to go back and say some things about what I think he's doing here. And part of my point is to actually unravel almost all the things that he wants to disqualify as part of terrain, I want to include as part of terrain. I think I want to have a more expansive sense of terrain. So let me read the quote, and then I'll come back and work through it. So he says, terrestrial life depends on a surface mantle of rock and soil, not more than a few meters deep, and the associated plant cover. The character and behaviour of this mantle under the influence of the climate determines its suitability for all types of land use. Terrain represents one of the triad factors of production: land, labour and capital. It differs from the others in being relatively fixed in location and extent, and in being more amenable to geographical forms of analysis. Accelerating population growth and earth-transforming technologies are changing the environment at an unprecedented rate, often for the worse. At the same time, modern methods of data processing make it possible to gather and manage information much more efficiently than hitherto. There is an urgent need to harness this capacity in order to improve land use and management. Then shifts to terrain evaluation. Terrain evaluation is an important technique in achieving this. It integrates other land resource factors, notably surface materials, soil, water and vegetation, on a common, readily comprehensible basis, such that a map of terrain can be used as a framework for the others. For this reason, it forms part of the interdisciplinary approach known as integrated survey. Now, I think this is interesting for a number of factors. It stresses the interaction between the layer of terrain, something that is above deep rock, so it has a limit to its vertical stretch or reach, but the interaction of that with climate. It relates this to the question of land use, i.e. how humans use and appropriate this, but then it quickly equates terrain with land, which is seen as one of the factors of production. Now, land, labour and capital obviously have a long history in economics around these ways of thinking about it. Karl Marx, for example, in Capital Volume 3, in a chapter called The Trinity Formula, talks about land, labour and capital, and talks about the way in which each can be seen as an economic relation. So land to rent, capital to profit, labour to wages. So he turns the physical into the economic quite quickly. Mitchell, I think here, usefully sees land as material, as more than merely the economic, although in his quick relation of it to land use, perhaps he's not that far away from turning it into a second-order question around that economic issue. And when he returned to his definition of terms about how he might define what this notion of terrain is, part of the point I think is interesting is that he wants to disqualify all sorts of things from being terrain or being within the remit of what he's trying to look at in this study. He says the New English Dictionary is helpful. Terrain, he says, is defined as a tract of country considered with regard to its natural features and configuration. And he sees that terrain is more useful than other terms that are either too general, such as environment or milieu, and he also wants to exclude ones that would bring in too many other sciences, such as physiography, geology, climatology, meteorology, oceanography, and natural phenomena in general. He says that terrain is more useful than either land or landscape, because landscape has got too many aesthetic qualities that he wants to disqualify from the way that he wants to approach this. And he says that land is unfortunately too tied up with questions of process, and he wants to exclude that too from his way of thinking about this. That seems to me to be a very telling thing. As I understand physical geography, a very clear distinction between land forms and land processes, and different types of work studying different aspects of that question. That processes are things that happen to land, or terrain, rather than terrain itself being seen as dynamic. For me, that is a problem that I would want to get beyond in thinking about this. It also makes a very clear distinction between topography, i.e. land features, and bathymetry, i.e. below surface of the water features. Again, I think that's problematic in reinforcing a strict land versus sea distinction, which I think is untenable given the complexity of both geophysical and geopolitical questions. And he also wants to exclude the atmosphere and the Earth's crust more than 6 meters below the surface from the way he's approaching it. So in a sense, as I said, what I'm going to try and do with terrain is to say many of the things he wants to disqualify, I want to bring back into the understanding of the notion of terrain. I want to be able to think about terrain in a way that can be either land or water or some mixture of the two, or blurring of the two, in indeterminate and changing environments, rivers, estuaries, marshes, swamps, glaciers, sea ice. I'm concerned with trying to develop a political theory of terrain which takes into account legal questions alongside economic, strategic, technical and scientific ones. Now, terrain in that expanded sense is the sort of thing that military geographers are trying to grapple with, even though I don't think they tend to qualify what they mean by terrain in this. And I think you can find examples of what might be called military terrain analysis back in some of the earliest military strategic texts. So Julius Caesar, for example, in the Gallic War, the War in Gaul, talks about the physical nature of the places that his troops are in and the battles that he fights, in a way about how does a military commander see a landscape, how do they think about it as a strategic and contested medium, rather than simply some kind of passive backdrop or container within which political military struggles take place. In other words, where's the best place to station your cavalry? Where would the infantry be? How can you use hilltops? How can you use wooded areas? How can you use marshy or swampy ground strategically in terms of fighting a war? You have something similar several centuries later in Niccolo Machiavelli suggesting that political rulers should make an effort to study terrain, both in order to defend their own, but also so that they can conquer others. And Machiavelli says that the best way for military commanders to learn this is actually through hunting. And hunting as a practice is a good way, he says, for understanding how you can become familiar with your terrain, how mountains rise, how valleys and plains spread, as well as with the characteristics of rivers and of swamps. And so there's a lot of work in military geography that studies some of these physical nature of terrain in order to understand how military strategy can either be employed in the future or to analyse how battles were lost and won historically. Thinking about the interaction of the human army and the physical nature of the terrain landscape. And at times this work has blurred to the point where the human gets taken out entirely. If you look at some military strategic planning operations where they look at the terrain of a battlefield without concern for the civilian population in those places, or particularly say with drone strikes, terrain becomes this almost virtual landscape in which operations are taking place without thinking about human life in there. Now, to sort of avoid confusion about what I'm doing and what some other work has done, I'm just going to say a very little bit about the Human Terrain project, which was a US military project. This is not what I mean by the notion of terrain, but it's the way that the term has been used that I want to say just a little bit about. This was the Human Terrain System project, which used social scientists embedded in the US military to understand the local population in areas in which the US was operating, particularly in Iraq, but also to an extent in Afghanistan. And the Human Terrain Team Handbook argues that a fundamental condition of irregular warfare and counterinsurgency operations is that the commander and staff can no longer limit their focus to the traditional parameters of military operation, which are mission, enemy, terrain and weather, friendly troops, support available, and time. Now they're suggesting the local population in the area of conflict must be considered as a distinct and critical aspect of the commander's assessment of the situation. So human terrain then for them is the population in the operational environment defined by social, cultural, anthropologic and ethnographic data and non-geophysical information about that human population and society. So what I think is interesting here is they say, well, the geophysical notion of terrain is already part of military planning. We want to add in a different dimension which is distinct from that, which is what they call human terrain, i.e. the population in those places. And that they're focusing on that human terrain in distinction from that normal military sense of terrain. It was a project that ran from 2007 to 2014 and understandably was strongly opposed by academic groups. The American Anthropological Association, for example, came out very strongly in opposition to this program of the sort of militarization of social science practice to think about these issues. Now, given the focus of this is almost exactly not what I want to think about with the notion of terrain. I'm not going to say any more about this here. Some people have done interesting work on this. Derek Gregory in geography might say for us in political science, international relations, have analysed this programme. But I just want to mention it as this term terrain is focused there, when their way of focus is the complete opposite of the way that we understand terrain in the standard way within military geography. So, it seems to me that in military geography, the geostrategic is reasonably well examined. I mean, it's part of the crucial element of how military geography understands how wars have been fought in the past or how they might be fought in the future. But strangely, terrain has not featured as a major question or theme in political geography or in political theory or international relations, the fields that I know best. It seems to me that that is surprising because terrain is crucial to understanding the political practice of territory, because terrain is the very thing that is divided into these political legal regimes across the world. But territory has often been seen in a fully abstract way that separates the political legal from any understanding of the physical and material state over which it is dividing and governing. And when it does account for that physical nature, it tends to think about it as sort of frozen in a single moment in time, rather than accounting for the processes that continually shape, transform, remake those territories. And those shortcomings, I think, are exemplified in two very recent books, and these are good examples. I'm not going to pick bad examples to be critical, I'm going to pick the good examples to show why even this useful good work doesn't really, for me, get to grips with some of these issues. It's Margaret Moore's Political Theory of Territory and Thomas Nail's Theory of the Border. And Thomas Nail doesn't say very much about the physical landscape at all in his study, in the theoretical part of his book. He briefly mentions the dynamic nature of geophysical features, and he says a very little bit about the idea of natural borders. But that's almost all that he says about the geophysical nature of what is divided by borders into territories, until he comes to the empirical part of the book, where he provides a very interesting reading of the US-Mexico border. And in the US-Mexico border reading, he talks about this in all of its political, historical and geographical richness and complexity. But it would be almost impossible to talk about the US-Mexico border without taking account of that geophysical aspect of that. And what it seems to me to be strange about this is that his theoretical work, the theory of the border, the title of the book, is almost completely lacking a theory of the geophysical. Even when he starts to employ this empirically, he realizes he has to bring this into his analysis. So why does his theory take account of these questions when his empirics so clearly does? And when he does, his material work tends to be on what has been built on that border rather than the geophysical features that are being made and shaped and transformed through those processes. Margaret Moore's book, I think, is rather different because it does say some things about the geophysical, but for me it doesn't really live up to its title. For me, a book that has got a title, Political Theory of Territory, would have much more discussion of what territory is or what territory has been taken to be, rather than simply assuming a fairly straightforward way of understanding territory and then applying political theory to it. She describes territory in what I would see as fairly uncomplicated, straightforward, problematic ways. Land over which some agent has political authority, meaning authority to make and enforce laws governing the conduct of inhabitants on the land, including laws defining and delimiting property rights. Then, taking that straightforward way of thinking about it, she can apply all of the complexities of political theory to understanding the issues around that. Issues around justice, property, rights, obligations, all of which are understood to be complicated concepts rather than simply complicated in practice. But with territory, she seems to think it's a fairly straightforward concept which is always complicated in practice. And I think that's problematic. I think really what she offers in this book is essentially a normative theory of territorial rights, how rights apply to territory, and the rights being very complicated. Territory itself seems to be, for her, straightforward and not especially complicated as a concept. So her incredibly sophisticated understanding of justice, of rights, of property, of obligation and so on, but very little understanding of the complexities around territory. And it seems to me to be strange, she's a political theorist, that she references almost nobody outside of the discipline of politics in trying to understand the question of territory. So there's no references to John Agnew, to Robert Sapp, to Doreen Massey, to David Storey, to David Delaney, to Susan Lalonde, to William Connolly, people that I would see are absolutely crucial to understanding the complexities around the notion of territory. All of the people that she's in dialogue with are political theorists who have talked about territory in this way of justice, rights and so on. Avery Kohler's, Alan Buchanan, Karen Nine, David Miller. All important, but for me not nearly sufficient to grasp these complexities. And she says that David Miller's approach, political theory approach, has produced, quote, almost universal acceptance, which is that territory needs to be defined as a triangular relationship between land, the people on that land, and the political institutions that govern that land. Now that definition seems to me to be only acceptable, let alone universally acceptable, if it completely masks all of the complexities about this notion of land or the notion of territory in itself. For her, it's simply land understood as a political and jurisdictional concept. So these are good examples of not dealing with the kinds of issues that for me are absolutely crucial to thinking about borders, to thinking about territory in this way. Now, I don't want to suggest that all of my own work has been completely devoid from these criticisms. In the previous work that was mentioned in the introduction, I tried to advance this idea of thinking about territory certainly as a political concept, certainly as a geographical concept, but one that has a number of different relations embedded within it. And the point of this work was not to say, I now have a better definition of territory, this sort of thing you could try out in a lecture and then go on and look at all the complexities of it in practice. But the point for me was to try to say, these are the registers that we would need to interrogate in order to understand how territory has been understood and practiced in different times and different places. That we should take at a minimum the economic, the strategic, the legal and the technical very seriously in understanding the way that territory is understood. And this is where I come to this idea that territory is political technology. Political technology not understood solely in terms of the narrow sense of the technical, although I think that's very important. Cartography, surveying, censuses, regulations, controls and so on. But also in terms of the techne, the techniques, in a sense that I've taken from the work of Heidegger and Foucault, where you think about the technologies as arts or practices or ways of doing or ways of engaging. So just that Foucault talks about population as a political technology, I want to think about territory as a political technology, to think about those terms in that way. The territory for me is a process, not an outcome. It's a stake in political struggles as well as the container of those struggles. The idea is to look at the entangled and multifaceted relations of the production, transformation and contestation of territory, rather than the idea that territory exists and then is challenged or contested. And it's led so far to 2 books, one a very contemporary political book, the Terror and Territory book, and then a very historical conceptual book, The Birth of Territory, which traces the emergence of this notion in Western political thought. Begins with the ancient Greeks and ends with Leibniz and Rousseau. So 2 quite different books in terms of the approach, but both in some ways trying to expand and open up this question of territory. The Shakespeare book that was mentioned in the introduction is a continuation of this. For me, Shakespeare is interesting because the moment he's writing, late 16th, early 17th century, is the very moment that political thought is starting to have this notion of territory emerge. And so Shakespeare, for me, with a sort of eye to the past and an eye to the present, opens up some of those questions in interesting ways. The next stage, though, I think for me, is to push this work a little bit further. While I'm privileged in these writings, the political legal and the political technical, as trying to break away from the narrower way that we traditionally understand territory, I think that the geophysical is really the next thing that I need to push. I think it's something that I don't say as much as I should about in those books. There's some, but there's not nearly enough, and there certainly wasn't a theorization of this. So it's an attempt to push beyond what I've done in the past on territory. Now, Bob Chester, state theorist, sociologist, in his most recent book does something that I think is helpful around this. I'm just going to read the first of these quotes, but the second one says something similar to it. Territory, he says, should not be confused with the more generic notion of terra, the terrestrial, and for him this encompasses land in its broadest sense, i.e. land in the subterranean, the sea, its depths and seabed, the air above and outer space. That the terrestrial provides a variable, technologically conditioned and relational raw material of territorialization as a specific political process. Now, I think he's completely correct here that territory is not the same as terra or the terrestrial, and he's got a very good, I think, expanded sense of what he means by the terrestrial. He wants to include a number of things that some people would want to exclude from that. But in much work, that notion of the terra, the terrestrial, is not taken into account at all in that. So he's making a distinction conceptually in order to analyse these questions. For me, what I'm most interested in is how do these two come together? How might we think of these two together? And conceptually, he's absolutely right in making the distinction, but in practice, these things are always entangled. It's how does that raw material get transformed through the process of territorialization, or to extend that, the processes of re-territorialization, the continual making and remaking of those issues. Now, part of the reason for this is what humans do to landscape, but it's also about what landscape does. We've long known that there are dynamic features of the earth that complicate straightforward political legal divides. Now, in the Byzantine Emperor Justinian's codification of classical Roman law, they come up with some issues around how rivers move in a landscape and how this can create legal property type disputes. In classical Roman law in Justinian's time, this was mainly to do with two farmers who would have a river running between their two fields, and the river would move in the landscape and the complexities this might mean for property relations. Today, these are the same kinds of issues that matter for states that use rivers as at least part of their boundary between them. So these issues about what happens if a river changes direction and land from one side is washed up on the other, or that the course of the river and the course of where the line used to be start to diverge. What happens if an island emerges in the middle of a river through the process of accumulation of debris, siltage and so on, and who owns the rights to a dried up riverbed? Now, these kinds of issues very much today crucial for thinking about states that use rivers as their boundaries. And often these are very large rivers. Sometimes these rivers are controlled, so something like the Rio Grande, for example, goes through big concrete channels in certain points in order to stop the river being this dynamic feature of the landscape, in order that you don't have that kind of problem. But other rivers are still relatively wild. The River Jordan is much smaller than certainly I imagine that the River Jordan would be. It's partly because so much of it has been diverted for irrigation projects. But the River Jordan, as an incredibly important contested feature of the landscape, but a river that is moving in the landscape and the complexities that come from this. Now, colleagues that I used to work with at Durham in the International Boundary Research Unit produced a database of river boundaries. And it's surprising how many land boundaries between states either use rivers or cross rivers at some point. It's about a third of the distance of the world's land boundaries actually have some relation to a river at some point. Now, if these rivers are moving in the landscape and things are happening to them, this creates problems for the international legal boundary issues around us. So how can we take account of that complexity in the way that we think about these questions of politics? Now, a recent example of this comes from Belgium, Netherlands, where the river marked in there on the black line going through that landscape, and the red line, which is the previous course of the river, which marks the boundary between those two states, and that these over time have diverged. And what the agreement that has been reached by Belgium and Holland recently is that they will exchange some small peninsulas of land that are in the wrong side, or on the wrong side of that boundary line, in order that the geophysical and the geopolitical can map back onto each other in a more exact way. Now, this example doesn't quite illustrate the point I'm making, because this was created by dredging works that were used to make the river a more easily navigable channel between two canals. But the point about the physical nature of where the river flows and the geopolitical line of where the river used to flow when it was fixed in the 19th century, the divergence of these two and the attempt by states to try to remedy this kind of situation by looking at it. Another example, which is not a river one, but is actually closer to where we are at present, is in the very northern part of the Norway-Finland border. It's a story, and my account of this is based on the report in the British media. Someone here may be able to correct me in terms of how the story was reported here. But it's a story about Norway and Finland, and about this point 200 metres north of the Arctic Circle, where the boundary of those two states meet. At this point, on a mountain spur of a much larger mountain, and the argument has been made that if Norway was to move its border by a mere 40 metres, then this would allow Finland to have its highest mountain. So, what you have, and this is my quick, crude way of explaining the story, there's a larger mountain of which there is a mountain spur, and the mountain spur, which some people see as the Finnish peak on this mountain compared to the higher Norwegian peak, which is about a kilometre away. Unfortunately, the line at the moment, the boundary line, cuts that mountain spur before you reach the summit of the mountain spur. If you were to move the boundary line by a mere 40 metres, the Finnish so-called peak of this mountain would now be in Finland, and give Finland a fairly flat country, its highest mountain, whereas Norway, a much mountainous country, wouldn't really miss this terribly much compared to it. So the story as it was reported in the British media, Norway considers giving a mountain to Finland as a 100th birthday present. Now what you can see, in at least the way this is represented here, is the problem you've got of drawing a geometrical line, a straight line segment at this point, over a complex geophysical landscape. And that this complicates this idea that you can have a straightforward geopolitical and geophysical correlation of these notions. Now, as I understand it, this nice gesture exchange between two friendly countries has come into problems for a political legal reason, which is that Norway's constitution says in Article 1 that Norway is a free, independent, indivisible and inalienable realm. And so the idea that you could give a small part of territory to a neighbour would come into constitutional problems around this. However, states regularly transfer small bits of their territory to neighbours for reasons like the Belgian-Holland one that I gave you in the previous example. And as I understand it, Norway has made very small land exchanges between other neighbours, Finland, one, and Russia, because of things where rivers have moved or where sandbars have emerged on coastlines, and where you need to sort of tidy up the geopolitical to match better to the geophysical, which is being transformed by these processes. So it's an example, close to home example, but an example that I hope begins to illustrate this point about the geophysical and the geopolitical not always being in strict relation to each other. I should say, though, that the other part of this story is the indigenous people in this area don't accept that either state should be drawing a boundary through their lands, and that actually the problem for them is not where the boundary is, but that there is a boundary, and that may be the problem in that area. So states then, conditioned by the material processes that they're confronted with, but also trying to shape them and transform them. This was a point that Neil Brenner and I made in a piece we wrote about Henri Lefebvre a few years ago now. Territory enables, we said, facilitates and results from the evolution of state action, and concomitantly state action produces, facilitates and results from the evolution of territory. Territory is always being produced and reproduced by the actions of the state and through political struggles over the latter, yet at the same time in the modern world, territory also conditions state operations and ongoing efforts to contest them. And then, riffing on Marx in the 18th Brumaire, states make their own territories not under circumstances they have chosen, but under the given and inherited circumstances with which they are confronted. So it was an attempt to try to think about that process then. This is really what I'm trying to do in this work, is now to push this further and to actually be more adequate to the theorization of some of these issues. And it's an example that has been called, in a term I wish I'd come up with myself, the territorial palimpsest. Thomas Siegler in his work on the Panama Canal, talking about this in the sense that Sarah Dillon and others have explored, is what a palimpsest is in a textual sense, a manuscript that's been scratched over so that a new text can be written on top of it. The palimpsest of landscape, or the palimpsest of territory or terrain, there are these different layers, different makings and remakings over time, and that these are all part of this complicated way of thinking about it. It's not that we have some kind of clean slate in which these territories are made or remade. It's that there are always these contested processes, some of which may be hidden or written over, but that are all there. Now, the notion of a palimpsest is used in both geomorphology, the study of earth transformation, but it's also used in landscape archaeology to look at some of these issues around this. But what's crucial, I think, in this, that's maybe a little bit different from the textual sense of the palimpsest, is that it's not that these layers are simply put on top of each other, but these layers are continually interacting with each other. And that helps, I think, to get at some of these dynamic, process-driven ways of thinking about these questions. Now, Thomas Siegler comes up with this in his work on the Panama Canal, which is a good example of this sort of process of states making and remaking their territory through these large-scale processes. Various people have done work on this, so Brian Davis and his colleagues, talking about the way that the Panama Isthmus, as the narrowest point of Central America between the two great oceans, how this has been transformed by a series of processes leading to the Panama Canal, now just over 100 years old. But there's a process at the moment of the Panama Canal being changed in order to allow bigger tanker and container ships to get through it. At the moment there is a standard, I'll come back to this, a standard for the Panamax, which is the size of a vessel that can fit through the locks, the channels and so on that constitute the Panama Canal. The argument being if you can expand this, then you would allow a vessel that is a bit longer, a bit broader, a bit deeper, but in total would carry double the volume, would be able to get through this, so a new Panamax standard. In order to achieve this, they have to do a lot of very large-scale land transformation processes, digging deeper channels, creating new reinforcement, rafting onto bedrock and so on, but also crucially the size of the reservoirs that are used for the water that will allow this to go through the locks, to go through the process and so on. So the massive land and water transformation processes that are needed to make this into the new stage or the next stage of the Panama Canal as a process. There's also a Chinese-led project for a canal through Nicaragua, through Lake Nicaragua and through some of the surrounding area there, which will also involve massive relocation of people, transformation of landscapes and so on. So it's again a sort of process of the making and reshaping of landscapes in those areas. All of which illustrates that these different ways that states shape and reshape their territories, whether it's damming a river for power or water storage, for draining a swamp, for building coastal or riverine fortifications, all sorts of large-scale infrastructure projects, roads, rails, canal networks and so on, resource extraction, these kinds of questions that physical geographers call anthropogeomorphology, what humans have done to the earth that can now be tracked through the study of geomorphology, the impacts that humans have on the physical landscape. Now, historically, some of the most interesting work I think, on this question has been done by people who studied technological transformations and so on. So Chandra Mukherjee, in 2 really remarkable books, has studied some of these questions. I'm going to say a very little bit about the first one and then a bit more about the second. The first one, Territorial Ambitions and the Gardens of Versailles, is a book that traces the parallel projects of the French court and French gardens. So the garden of the Palace of Versailles is a landscape transformation project to turn it into the site, as a parallel to the more grander scale shaping of France at that same time. How France creates its boundaries, its fortifications, its canals, its forests, its landscapes, and so on. So both at the smaller scale and at the larger scale, these transformational projects of landscape through French politics at the period. Very interesting way of looking at these questions. The following book, I think, in some ways is even more interesting because it traces the Canal de Midi, which is a 17th century project to build a canal that links the Atlantic to the Mediterranean, just to the north of the Pyrenees, northeast of the Pyrenees. Now, it's a project that is led by the king and by the court, but relies on the local expertise of the people in the area and the local technologists, engineers, and so on to do this. The transformation of territory, creation of a new route between these 2 seas, but also what you have to do to the landscape to make this possible. It was built 2 centuries before the British canal system, 2 centuries before the Lake Erie Canal in North America. And she says in this book right at the beginning, this project was not technically possible by the standards of engineering knowledge at the time. So they had to create new techniques in order to make this possible. And part of the reason was, at the point of the watershed between the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, this canal needed to get to about 200 meters in altitude. So that you had to find a way of, in a canal system, getting ships up to 200 meters above sea level in order that they can then go down to clear this watershed. And this involved 100 locks to get them to make that distance in elevation. So it involved a huge amount of digging, tunneling, earth relocation, bank reinforcement, running water through dry landscapes, either continually dry or seasonally dry landscapes. Huge amounts of work on hydraulics, breach, lock, reservoir and holding tank construction, and other ancillary buildings. They came to realise that this wasn't simply a process of build it once and then it's there, but it needed to be continually renewed, repaired, maintained, because of issues such as the building materials. A lot of wood was used, these rotting over time, the siltage, the drainage, the degradation of building materials through rainwater and through the process of water flushing through there and so on. Sandbars would start to emerge at certain points in this, so a continual process of maintenance and repair to make this possible. She describes it as the silent demonstration of disciplinary power over the earth, the cultural power of political territoriality. And she notes that even though there was that human domination of the landscape in a sense was kind of reacting back, the earth and the water continually evaded the control of those that tried to build it, displaying the excess powers that nature brings to human projects. So it required all sorts of technical knowledge to make this possible, from cartographic surveying to legal techniques such as land purchase, the planning of the engineering, all of which required analysis of the terrain through which it was to cut. But it also was a project of reshaping that terrain, the implications of this large-scale process on there. In her terms, strategics required logistics. The political and legal required the scientific and the technical. It showcased, her terms, a political logic of territorial administration based on works rather than words. What is done rather than what is said is a way of thinking about territory. A matter of territorial governance, she calls it. And this certainly fits with the way that I've tried to understand questions of territory, but in the terms that I'm developing here today, it's a geophysical landscape that is being transformed through a geopolitical purpose, but that is still being limited by that geophysical, by the availability of political technologies, but also what the landscape does, reacts back to those processes. And many other people have done work that I would see as sympathetic to what I'm trying to outline here today. From Olivia Razak's work on a political history of barbed wire, of how barbed wire as a relatively straightforward technology has allowed the enclosure and production of different spaces. And the examples he takes are the prairie lands of the United States, through to the trenches of the First World War, through to the concentration camps of the Boer War and the Second World War, and the way that the barbed wire as that technology is used to transform those landscapes through that process. Andrew Barry's work, Material Politics, which is a study of the pipeline through the Caucasus, particularly through Georgia, of how a geoeconomic project is limited by both the geophysics of that region but also the geopolitics of the area. Other work, Charlotte Krupa's Hotspotters report, really wonderful book on the military legacies of toxic waste on both landscapes and on bodies, particularly in the American West, where nuclear testing areas or other military firing ranges and so on have transformed the landscape and leave a legacy long after the examples of what she's done. And in a similar way to the way that Rachel Woodward flipped military geography in a sense on its head. Traditional military geography, as I said earlier in the talk, traditional military geography has looked at the way the landscape acts as a limit or a condition to military action. What Woodward does in this book and in related work is to say, what's the legacy of the military on the landscape? Military bases, military firing ranges, military sites, and so on. How do these transform and create a landscape in a particular place? So it's a way of reversing the focus of traditional work. And environmental devastation, either as an unintended or an intended legacy of war, is long-standing. There's the possibly apocryphal stories of Rome, classical Rome, ploughing salt into the fields of Carthage to prevent them from growing crops in that area, through to more recent examples of scorched earth retreats in World War II, to Agent Orange, the deforestation agent in Vietnam, to Saddam Hussein's forces, Kuwaiti oil wells being set on fire, dumping oil into the Persian Gulf and so on. So there's this transformational landscape through war, intended or unintended consequences of this. Other people have worked on the transformational landscapes through the oil, gas, coal industry. So Timothy Mitchell's work or Matthew Huber's work. Debbie Lyle talking about the entanglements of war, tourism and landscape, thinking about those kinds of issues. So many people have done work that I would see as helpful to thinking about this issue of the geophysical, geopolitical relation. Now, as I suggested earlier, territory has often been understood in relation simply to static, dry land. But the land-sea relation complicates that. Many land states, land-bound states, use their coastlines as their borders and then use that border as the baseline from which they lay their claim to the sea and then to the exclusive economic zone that they can extend beyond there. Now, there's an established body of international law on the sea, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS. But as people like Phil Steinberg, political geographer at Durham University, have suggested, while we have that land territory law and we have that law of the sea, what happens where we have places that blur geophysical states and geopolitical legal regimes? Ice being a classic example of this. It's something that at certain times can be a solid and at certain times can be a liquid, and so that it can blur that complexity. So he began a conversation, do we need a law of ice to go with the law on land, territory law, and law of the sea? But other geophysical features also blur these legal regimes. River deltas, coastal swamps, glaciers, rivers more generally, marshlands and so on. And one of the points I think that comes from this is that these dynamic features of the Earth's surface, where they're geophysically dynamic, become geopolitically complicated. There's then a problem about how we think about these in terms of political legal regimes, both conceptually and I think practically. And the ICE Law project, as mentioned in the introduction, is an attempt to try to come up with ways of thinking and ways of informing practice that would be adequate to that kind of problem or that complexity. Now, initially when this project started, it was called ICE Law, as in a law of ice. In our initial discussions, though, we began to think of all these other things that complicate these legal regimes through their geophysical state. And so we came up with this, ICE Law is now an acronym, The first part of which I think is brilliant, the second part I'm less convinced with. Ice now is indeterminate and changing environments, so it include ice in the narrower specific sense, but all of these other things, rivers, swamps, and so on. Law is now law of the Anthropocene and the world, and it's an attempt to try to get at the range of questions that this throws up. So this project, which is funded by the Leverhulme Trust, supported by Durham and the University of the Arctic, is an attempt to bring anthropologists, lawyers, political scientists, geographers, both political geographers and physical geographers, together to try to think about some of these complexities and these kinds of issues. Now, it was certainly sparked by issues in the Arctic that need a better way, we think, of understanding these kinds of questions, where states are trying to map the seabed in order to lay claim to large areas of the sea that extend beyond their coastlines, whether this is about environmental issues, whether it's about resource issues, how climate change is making changes for that. So north of Canada, for example, previously frozen areas between islands that Canada had always seen as sort of the extension of its territory northwards, and now becoming, at least seasonally, navigable channels. And the United States, for example, is seeing this as a possibility of being able to sail from Maine to Alaska over the north of Canada. And these issues about whether this was an internal water, frozen for Canada, or whether this could actually become an international shipping channel. So these kinds of issues of access, of military, of resources, of environment, and so on, are raising some of these questions. And colleagues at this boundary research unit at Durham came up with this map a few years ago, which has recently been updated, to show the claims that different Arctic states have made to the north, and the overlapping nature of those claims. And this only gives an indication of the work they've done for this, but the different complex political, economic, legal, environmental, etc. geographies that we need to think about to raise some of those questions. Now, this also becomes more important when you go beyond that two-dimensional and you start to think about the seabed, you start to think about the ocean depths, you start to think about the fishing rights in the volume of the water, and so on. Now, when we had this initial workshop around this ice roll project, and I was asked to speak about my work on territory, after hearing a lot of these lawyers and anthropologists and environmental scientists and so on saying that so much of our existing thinking was inadequate to deal with these kinds of complexities. And I said, I completely get that you think that territory is inadequate to understand these complexities. But for me, that's not because territory is not the right concept to think about these things. It's that most of our existing ways of thinking about territory are actually inadequate to deal with the complexities of territory on land. And that if we have a more sophisticated understanding of the question of territory, this might be helpful in thinking about the complexities that you're trying to deal with in your diverse fields around issues in the Arctic and in other, what we're calling indeterminate and changing environments. So this work on the geophysical, the material that I'm now doing, in part has come out of a response to these challenges by these scientists, by these anthropologists, by these lawyers and so on, even though I hope my previous work on territory is helpful to them in thinking about territory in a broader way around those issues. I should say two immediate cautions to this attempt I'm trying to do to bring the geophysical back into the geopolitical. One is that geography has sort of been here in the past thinking about these issues, which is the old problem of what's called geographical or environmental determinism. The idea that if you know something about the geography, the physical geography of a landscape, this can tell you something about the characteristics of the people in a particular area. Now, this has been used in the past for racial projects, for colonial projects, of understanding the characteristics of the people to do with the physical landscape and the environment in which they're in. I think some kind of geographical determinism is coming back, not with the colonial racial aspects, but in this sense of if you understand where a mountain range is, or you understand what an island nation is, or you understand, then you will understand some dynamics of a country. Robert Kaplan's recent The Revenge of Geography by Robert Kaplan, or Timothy Mitchell's book on prisms of geography, both in some senses are kind of determinist in the way that they think about the physical landscape and its understanding. I want to be cautious around those kind of questions, but I don't think this means we can ignore the geophysical entirely in the way that we think about this. The other one is the political, which is that a lot of appeals to the earth as a ground for politics in the past have accompanied regressive political regimes. So Friedrich Ratzel's notion of Lebensraum, or Martin Heidegger's notion of the relation between earth and world, and then what he called a kind of philosophical autochthony, the rootedness of concepts in the German soil. Or Carl Schmitt, a book which is unaccountably popular in international relations at the moment, The Nomos of the Earth. So all of these tied to a deeply regressive reactionary politics, and so I want to be, again, cautious around that. But I think that there's important and interesting work that's been done. Neil Smith, the geographer, I think did interesting work on this, around the relations between nature, the social and capital, very much a project from the left that I think is trying to force us to take better account of these kinds of issues. Now, I also see this work as potentially having links to some of the most interesting work that's going on in urban studies at the moment. I talked about that a little bit in relation to Stephen Graham's work earlier on, but I want to push this a little bit further about thinking about the way that the urban interacts with the physical landscape, the physical nature of areas. So you can look at the way that terrain is transformed, but is not entirely something that is entirely malleable or entirely something that can react in that way. You find a number of states that reclaim land from the sea in Singapore, Hong Kong, Mumbai, New York, for example, the kind of production or indeed the fabrication of space. But so too in the creation of space above or below the surface by tunnelling or building. So in New York City at the moment, the Hudson Yards project, which is this idea of building a very large-scale new living and business environment, which involves putting a roof over the Long Island Railroad yards where they keep the trains overnight in order that you can then build above the surface. And so it's a kind of a vertical project that involves burying what is already there in order to construct above that surface. If you have somewhere like Macau as well, Macau is a fascinating place for some of these processes happening. Macau is, at least as that map suggests, a small peninsula off China and 2 offshore islands. But it's actually transformed dramatically in the last century through large-scale land reclamation projects. So you now wouldn't know that the 2 islands are actually distinct islands. They've filled in all of the land between those 2 islands. And if you've ever been to Macau or seen pictures of Macau, nearly all of the big casinos are built on that reclaimed land between those 2 islands. These are casinos that make the ones in Las Vegas look small. They're absolutely enormous, and they're all built on this reclaimed land. The airport too is a land reclamation project in there. And so you have this extension of the territory of Macau through these large-scale land projects to doubling the size of it, and there are further projects that are underway, areas under construction where those bridges link the part of the peninsula, the mainland, to those offshore islands as an extension and creation of territory. Another interesting one is that the University of Macau, which was previously on the middle island, number 6 on that map, is now leasing a part of mainland China for its new campus. And so you get all sorts of interesting legal jurisdictional complications, because as a British citizen I can go to Macau without a visa, but I can't go to China without a visa. But I could go to the University of Macau because it's part of Macau, even though it's part of this island, Henquin Island, off the coast. And so you have all these complexities of political legal regimes interacting with the physical nature of the landscape in those places. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to move towards the conclusion. I could say something more about the urban, but I won't talk about that. I just mentioned the work of Gaston Bourdillot, who is doing interesting work around the notion of terrain alongside what I'm trying to do with this notion of terrain. And he's tried to propose this as a way of coming to grips with this, the texturing, the folds, forms, textures, and volumes of space, and thinking that terrain is really the concept that we most need to push to think about those kinds of issues. And we've begun to think about how our work complements or contrasts with each other. I think what he's trying to do is to develop an understanding of terrain in itself, whereas what I'm most interested in is terrain as a way of getting to grips with questions around the materiality of territory. So in conclusion then, for me terrain is crucial because it combines materiality and strategy, the physical and the human nature of geography, the way this adds to and complicates political legal questions. So terrain for me is not something that is static, something that is fixed, to which dynamic processes happen. Terrain for me is itself something that is dynamic. I want to break away from that land-sea distinction that I think structures too much political legal thinking, to make sense of this, these indeterminate and changing environments. The terrain encompasses slope, texture, matter and motion, spatial process as well as spatial form. It makes possible or constrains political, legal and strategic projects even as it is shaped by them. It's where the geophysical and the geopolitical meet. So while I want to develop this in future work, I want it to be both historically informed, to draw on theory, and there's some other theories that I'm drawing on that I haven't been able to mention today. I also want it to be something that is useful to people that are grappling with these kinds of issues in practice, the lawyers, the anthropologists that are working in the iStore project around these issues. How does this theorization help us better to understand what's happening with sea ice melt, rising sea level, islands that may be disappearing entirely or their coastline is changing, river boundaries, the encroachment of deserts, and so on. The territory's materiality for me encompasses both the built and the physical landscape and the interrelation between them. It's thinking that relation between them that's the crucial one here. And so for all these reasons, this is why I think in order to be able to think about these issues, why we can think about vertical, the volume, infrastructure, for me a political legal theory of terrain would be useful to do that work. Thank you.
Thank you extremely for this lucid and wonderfully informative presentation. So we'll open up for questions from the audience. While you're thinking, I will start with a question that's, I guess, a big one. It's basically about the dimension of time in your work. Because some of the concepts that you draw on here, or not draw on, but some of the issues that you bring up are really also extremely temporal dimensions, such as processes and the malleability and some of the challenges that you pose for the kind of flat discourse of photography and so on. So I'm just wondering how, to what extent you kind of explicitly address notions of temporality in some of this more recent work in particular. Also because, as I mentioned briefly in the introduction, that the kind of this geological notion of space also, of course, has a very temporal dimension to it.
Yeah, that is a big question. There is certainly a temporal dimension to what I'm trying to think about, and in this paper it's not explicit, but if you think about what geologists call deep time as a process, and a lot of these things that I'm saying are dynamic landscapes are not obviously visible dynamic landscapes. These are things that change over long periods of time, but nonetheless do change. What I think is happening with something like climate change is an acceleration of some of those processes. So, you know, people in English used to use glacial to mean very, very slow. I think we might need to revise how we use the term glacial, because if you look at the way the glaciers are being transformed, there's a project, an Italian project, looking at the Italian-Austrian border and a glacier that forms part of that border, and how fast that glacier is changing and how that is transforming the geophysical and therefore may create complications to the geopolitical. So there are certainly processes, some of which are happening very quickly and some of which are happening very slowly. I mean, I think it was yesterday the highest temperature in Antarctica was recorded, and the speed at which things are happening, and that these processes then reinforce each other in terms of the speeding up of the melt in Siberia, which through the process of melt is releasing more of the gases that create the melt, and so this process reinforcing. So the dynamics of this and the kind of the speed element of this, I think, is important. There's also the temporal in terms of the historical, and around some of these concepts, and so previous work has looked at the history of the concept of territory, and in some degree what I'm trying to do in part is the history of the concept of terrain and the notion of the earth, and the earth as a dynamic, holistic thing. So there's some conceptual history in there as well as another way of thinking about it. But from my first book was to try and think about a notion of what I call in that book spatial history, of how do you take into account questions of spatiality in geography alongside questions of temporality in history, and to try and think these together rather than one is the preserver, the historian, and one is the preserver, the geographer. So I've tried to think about that relation. It's the same with the work on Henri Lefebvre. You know, Lefebvre is understood to be the theorist of space so much. What we tried to do when we translated the rhythm analysis book was to say, yes, he was, but he was also an important theorist of time. And the rhythm analysis book is one example of that, but there's a book called The End of History, and some of these other work on the notion of moments. Lefebvre is a really interesting theorist of time, but in people who read Lefebvre in English have not always been exposed to that. So a lot of my work is trying to think these two together, and I would hope generally it would inform this work, yes.
Thank you.
Okay, so I have a question here.
Okay,
Okay, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Over there first.
Yeah, I enjoyed this talk a lot, learned a lot from it, as somebody who's not a specialist in these matters, really. Particularly, I learned a lot from your discussion of this relationship between the geopolitical and the geophysical, politics and terrain. My question really follows on, I think, from Susanna's, which is, I wondered to which extent there is a kind of a general argument underlying this, that the geopolitical has a slower rhythm or a slower temporality than the terrain. That the terrain is not just processual and dynamic, but tends to be more dynamic and perhaps even more now with climate change, so that the temporality of the geopolitical is having to play catch-up all the time, and that perhaps that's a part of how politics works.
I think that's a really interesting question because, in a sense, what I tried to outline is how the geopolitical and the geophysical differ spatially. You know, so the borderline between Belgium and Holland with the river and having to think about how that might work. But I think it's an interesting way to think about it. Is that it's that, but it is also partly that their temporalities are not working in the same way. The rhythms are not in sync, or something. You know, there might be a way of trying to think about it in those terms. I would maybe, though, caution that it is one that is always faster than the other, because I think that there are some times when the geophysical is very slow and the geopolitical can happen very, very rapidly. And if you look at something like Israel and the Golan Heights, so the first slide that I showed with a picture standing in Israel looking over the Golan Heights towards Syria, after Israel occupied that in '67, the speed at which Israel did things that had a geophysical implication, the geophysical was transformed by a set of geopolitical decisions, whether it was through population transfers, changing the nature of land from one purpose to another purpose, building settlements, changing Mount Hermon into a ski resort for Israel, which is something that a postdoc who's working with me, Mario Ram, is working on, a notion of what he calls cryopower, which is a way of trying to get a kind of cold ice and snow, and the political implications of that. So that the geopolitical can happen very, very rapidly, then has later geophysical So I think that the point about the rhythms not being in sync with each other or the temporalities being different, I think is really important, but I wonder whether it's not one is always faster than the other or precedent, but there may be processes of that that are different either way, but that's really helpful, thank you.
Could you please present yourself?
Thank you for a very interesting lecture. You are very convincing, I think, on your arguments within the spatial perspective. But all the time I hear something like visibility. I hear something like when you are talking about center and other words, it's about visibility and geopolitical symbols, like the ones you started with in Israel about the roads for, it's a kind of class division and nationalist division or whatever you call it. So all the time we are in this split between that we know politics is so much about visibility, even if we are talking about the water conditions in the Golan Heights and the need for water in many places of the world. It turns into a kind of very visible political strategy. And of course you agree, but in a way, could you say something about mapping diagrams and all that kind of diversion concepts that is, when you are talking here, they are used as a kind of strategic weapon by using symbolism, by using some kinds of visibilities. And even if you are going into politics, also the way we are making diagrams and mapping seems to be important in negotiations and the fight between the borders.
I think that's probably right, that I do privilege the visible. And partly because I'm showing as well as telling, and so that there's I can illustrate some of the points most convincingly by showing you either landscapes that I've taken a photograph of or maps that have tried to capture some of those, and so there's a visible nature about how this is presented in one way. I do think that there's been a lot of very good work clearly in visual culture and media and studies and so on, but there's also been interesting work in what might be called visual geopolitics, to think about different ways of thinking about those issues and about the privileging of that as a register. And I keep falling back on Israel-Palestine as my examples because it's somewhere I know a bit about, but it's also because it's just so striking for so many of these things. If you look at what certainly in the UK would usually be seen as unproblematic maps, so the map of the nightly weather forecast or the map of natural reserves in a country, if you look at those in Israel-Palestine, they're incredibly political. Where those boundaries get drawn in terms of how they might say the nightly weather prediction for the next day. It includes the Golan, it often includes the West Bank and Gaza as part of this homogeneous, this is the area that we are looking at, this is Israel. Similarly with nature reserves, these are not respecting the geopolitical because they're trying to put forward a different purpose, but those are interesting. And they're ways of representing that push forward a particular kind of power message. I wouldn't though want to say that the notion of terrain is purely something that is a visual thing. I've yet to sort of try to work this through in writing, but we mentioned this briefly in the seminar yesterday. I do a lot of cycling, and as a cyclist, you feel terrain as much as you see terrain. I'm sure that those of you that are skiers or other kind of sports will have a more kind of corporeal sense of a terrain rather than simply a ocular sense of terrain. And we were talking yesterday about what the Dutch call false flats, which is also something that I know from cycling. This is a road that appears to be straight, but as you cycle up it, you realise you're going up a bit of a hill. And the notion of gradient is really important to me as a cyclist, because it's not how high a mountain is, but it's the slope of the road as you go up the mountain that is the thing that you physically feel in your legs as you're climbing on the bike. So there's a kind of another way that you can encounter terrain that for me would be important in a broader theorisation of it. And I think that Gaston Bourdieu, the anthropologist I mentioned briefly at the end, is good on this because he's trying to think about different types of terrain and then the kind of physical effective ways that these look at it. Somebody else who I didn't get to mention in the talk, Derek Gregory, who's written about the soldier's lived experience in particular kinds of landscape, what he calls the natures of war, where he talks about the rainforests of Vietnam or the deserts of North Africa or the mud of the trenches of the First World War, and how you hear this, you feel this, you smell this, you sense this, as well as see this. So there's certainly work that's beginning to do that, and I would want, in a more expanded sense of this work, to push beyond the merely visual, although I recognise that's what I privileged today, definitely. Yeah.
I just suggest that you all present yourself before posing a question, even though you will represent the question still.
Yeah, well, Mark Darling. Stuart, thank you for the talk. It was really very fascinating. I suppose the question I wanted to ask was, I think when we, scholars critically engage with the kind of conceptual vocabulary of the disciplines in which we work, the aim is often to overcome what is left out of the previous conceptualizations. And sometimes that leads to then a kind of critical, reflexive question about what the categorization that we've constructed, which aims to be so expansive, leaves out. What's constitutive limits are. So the question I want to ask is, where does terrain stop now in this conceptualization you've developed? What are its limits? So one of the impressions I have is that think about the human, for example, that so the human interaction upon the land or upon the environment, political, individual, etc. That sort of in a way counts as terrain. But I wonder about the human body itself, for example. Does that come under the remit of terrain for you? Is the way that we're configured in this room, or the way that we dress, or our gestures, are these part of terrain? Likewise, I guess the sort of questions about limits of measurement or extent, how far vertically might we go before we're outside terrain? Maybe that changes in relationship to sort of political claims or technologies that are made upon space or far. Is terrain also a question of the future? In the sense that is the future kind of terrain insofar as claims are made upon it, or projects are developed from the future, obviously sort of forms of representation or ways of making kind of claims upon future conditions. Is representation itself a kind of terrain? Is the surface of the paper a terrain as opposed to the representation of the terrain, etc.?
It's a very fair question. I've been critical of people in the past who've tried to come up with a new concept, because if it's so broad it's everything, then it actually ends up explaining nothing. So I'm sort of aware of that, and I think it's a fair comment to raise. I suppose what I'm trying to propose here is terrain as a way of thinking about issues rather than trying to make everything into terrain. And for me, it's that physical and the built landscape and the interaction between them as something that we need to take account of in any number of different ways that we think about things politically. And that it seems to me that a lot of work in political geography has not been adequate to deal with that complexity. So I'm trying to push that work to better account for it. And as I tried to indicate, there's a lot of people that I think are doing work in that register that I've been able to draw on and build on what they're doing around that. I wonder whether, I mean, how far you could say that the human body outside of that environmental interaction, and I know that my work has been criticised in the past for where are the bodies, kind of. You look at a lot of these sort of empty landscapes and think about, you don't think as much as you should about the body in this. And one of the common ways that I'm sure I respond to people's work and people respond to mine is, yeah, but what about this? What about that? And they keep adding things, even if I'm trying to confine and contain what I'm doing. It's like, but this is also important, that also helps. So I'm kind of aware of those tensions, and I'm not, at this stage of the work, entirely clear how to be adequate to them. I suppose, and I kept this out of the talk, but I wonder whether I should have put it in. In a sense, what I'm trying to do here is to try and think how political geography can rise to the challenge of what's called the Anthropocene. And I think that if political geography or critical geopolitics are adequate to their name, which has got this geo element in there, they need to actually be more adequate to thinking about that notion of the geo in their work. And I think that what has happened in a lot of political geography or geopolitics is it's kind of become big international relations. It's become international relations at a global scale, but the geo element has been lost in there. And in a sense, that's what I'm trying to push, is to sort of bring that geo back in, but hopefully in a way that's attentive to some of those problems that it's been used in the past, either politically or that sort of environmental determinism thing. So in a sense, that's what I'm trying to do, and it's the beginning of a conversation, beginning of thinking through those issues. That, I mean, it's a huge challenge, I think, to deal with, to a political geography that is adequate to the challenge of the Anthropocene. But in a sense, that's why it has to be so expansive, because of that transformation of and the implications of that transformation on so many human-environment interactions. So that's why, in a sense, it has to be big. And at the moment, it seems to me to be that terrain is a helpful way of trying to begin grappling with that challenge, because it combines those two things. That terrain is a term used in physical geography and in military geography. So you've got the strategy and the geophysical together. Okay, so can we push terrain in a political geographical, political legal, political theoretical register as a way of dealing with that? That's what I'm trying to do, I think, with this.
Then just a short one, because...
Sorry, I'm still...
just a short question, because when you are referring back to Heidegger and others, when you are talking about the body and so on, what they are stressing, I think, is experience. So in a way, it's very difficult to talk about terrain. Maybe it's more easier to talk about terrain vague, because you never have a neutral, innocent, as you say, landscape. You always put something into it. For instance, experience as in German, Erlebnis und Erfahrung.
No, I mean, that's a good point. I'm glad you mentioned the German at the end, because that was a quick response to it. Was that part of Heidegger's point with the experience was Erlebnis, in which there is the notion of the Leb, the body, and the Heidegger's distinction between the Leb and the Körper as the sort of lived body and the physical, material nature of the body. And so for him, experience was an embodied way of being in a world. So yes, the bodily comes through in that. I mean, the Heidegger point in this paper was the Heidegger and the philosophical nationalism, philosophical racism of the way that his thought worked, and trying to caution from that. But certainly in terms of my broader work, I mean, I've done a lot of work on Heidegger, and I've made the claim that both Foucault and Lefebvre, Heidegger is a crucial thinker. People know this with Foucault because Foucault says it himself, but I think with Lefebvre as well, Heidegger is extremely important as a figure to think with and think against in the formation. And really for me, Heidegger, Foucault, Lefebvre have shaped all of my work, even though in this paper I don't think I mentioned Foucault and Lefebvre. I mean, it just informs all of the work that I've done around issues of politics and space and territory and so on. So yes, I accept that Heidegger is important in there. And in this paper I just mentioned, Heidegger is one of these kind of figures for whom that attachment to place, attachment to soil, attachment to the landscape was very important and has these philosophical and politically reactionary tendencies. And I was trying to say, I'm aware of that, but I want to avoid that in what I'm doing and see this more as a project from the left. But Heidegger is, for me, is almost impossible to escape because of how much he's influenced my work, but also the two other thinkers that are most important to me, Heidegger and Foucault and Lefebvre.
Okay, so we will have time for one very quick last question, if there is one. Otherwise, we'll close for lunch. Open for lunch. Close for lunch. Okay.
Hi, thanks for a great talk. A couple of times you've mentioned in your own work, you've mentioned that your work has been critiqued for not dealing with questions of embodiment. And yet a couple of times in the talk you showed photographs, one of which I think you shot in Israel-Palestine, right? And then the other one on the US-Mexico border. So I'm just wondering if you could use those instances when you were there shooting photographs to try to make the dynamism of terrain intelligible. If you could talk a little bit more about that process, and because it seems like those are opportunities for you to excavate some of these issues that you admit you've been critiqued for. So I'm just wondering if you want to do that at all.
And that's a good question, and that might be a way to begin to approach that question. And one of the defences I've offered with the secure volume piece that I mentioned and that some of us discussed yesterday, one of the critiques of that was, where are the bodies in all of these photographs that are in that piece? And one of my defences was, have you ever taken pictures in Israel, Palestine? Have you ever taken pictures in the West Bank? Have you ever taken pictures on the Israel-Lebanon border? If you have people in those pictures, then you're more likely to be stopped or problems arise from that, and in terms of permission and so on. So it was a deliberate attempt, in a sense, to keep bodies out of some of those photographs, or certainly the ones that I chose to use. But the Israel-Palestine one, I mean, the physical nature of because I've had a visiting post in Israel and a visiting post at the Palestinian University, and one of my defences against the sort of boycott, divestment, sanctions thing is, look, I work on territory and borders. If I was a mathematician, maybe I would feel differently about going and speaking in Israel, but given that I go and talk about territory and always talk about Israel-Palestine as one of my examples, for me, there's a purpose about being there. But the other thing about going is, I always ask to be taken to sites, taken by critical geographers, political scientists, whoever, in those places to get to see things that I would never normally get to see. So there's a physical importance for me of being able to get to some of those areas in the West Bank, or other photos in the secured volume piece of Area E1, which is a place that you would not get to unless you had somebody who was prepared to take you there. There's no public transport, no taxi would take you there. Or to Bedouin settlements in the Negev or something like that. Israel and the US-Mexico border was an example of when I gave a talk at Arizona, and I asked if some of the graduate students who were working on that could take me to sites so that I could see that. So there's certainly a kind of my presence in the sites, which I then used to illustrate some of it. This landscape was when two Palestinian academics took me for dinner, and they wanted to show me a site of Palestine that did not look like the border checkpoints, the roadblocks, they wanted to show me the physical nature and beauty of the landscape in those. So I could maybe begin to do more with that, of me as a photographer in those places, and with the exception of the photographs of the Norway-Finland border mountain issue, all of the photographs are mine in this, and I've begun using photographs in this work, my own photographs in this work, to try and illustrate some of the points. So it might be a way to begin that, but maybe it's the visual, but it's, for me, it's being able to see some of these landscapes that I'm trying to think about, or that then become examples of what I'm doing. It's been really helpful in this. And sort of breaking out my training as a political theorist or history of ideas person who is happiest in a library or an archive. So, but whether I can push it further, I don't know, but that's a really helpful thought. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you again, Stuart, and